It started as one of those perfectly ordinary afternoons that you barely remember the next day. The kind where the coffee's gone lukewarm on your desk, the fluorescent lights hum a little too loudly, and you're knee-deep in tedious work that no one will ever thank you for. That's exactly where Josh found himself. Tucked away in a tiny editing booth at a massive Hollywood studio, scrubbing through raw footage for a project he wasn't even credited on. Just another day in the underbelly of show business. The only difference was that this day would detonate his life like a grenade, and, strangely enough, it all began with Denzel Washington walking into his world. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Josh wasn't the kind of guy who got starstruck. Not anymore. When you work in Hollywood, even the A-listers start feeling like part of the furniture. But Denzel Washington wasn't furniture. He was, well, Denzel. The man radiated a calm confidence that made you want to sit up straighter. He had stopped by the editing suite on the lot with a simple request: retrieve a few clips from the studio's secure server. It was meant to be quick, easy, and unremarkable. But life rarely sticks to the script. As Josh navigated the database to find the files Denzel wanted, he noticed something odd buried in the same project folder. A set of encrypted video files with no labels, no project tags, nothing to indicate what they were. Curiosity might have killed the cat, but in Hollywood, curiosity has a way of making you famous or infamous. Josh clicked. What played on the screen wasn't just shocking. It was the kind of footage you don't unsee. A powerful producer, one of the biggest names in the industry, was caught in compromising situations that went beyond scandal. There were scenes of assault, hushed conversations about payoffs, and documents detailing bribes to cover it all up. It was a cinematic horror reel of real life, and Josh felt his stomach twist. He knew, in that instant, that this was more than just gossip-worthy dirt. It was evidence, the kind that could end careers, topple empires, and maybe even land someone in prison. He sat frozen for a moment, the weight of what he'd stumbled upon pressing down on him. Then he glanced at Denzel, who was leaning casually against the doorframe, watching him work. Josh's hands trembled slightly as he turned the screen toward him. He didn't say much, just handed over the USB drive where the files were now stored. He could have deleted them. He could have pretended he never saw them. But something in Denzel's steady gaze made him feel like doing the right thing wasn't optional. Denzel didn't overreact. He didn't panic. He simply nodded, took the drive, and left with a quiet, "You did good, kid." And for a brief moment, Josh thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. The very next morning, he was called into HR. The room was cold, the air stale. They didn't bother with pleasantries. They accused him of stealing company property and unauthorized access to sensitive files. It didn't matter that he hadn't shared them with the press, or that the files documented crimes. The only thing that mattered was that he had crossed an invisible line, one that protected the powerful. By the time the meeting was over, Josh's ID badge was deactivated, his desk was cleared, and security was escorting him out of the building like he was a criminal. That night, he sat in his tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had just destroyed his career. Who would hire someone branded as a traitor in an industry where reputation is everything? He tried to comfort himself with the thought that at least he had done the right thing. But the right thing doesn't pay rent. The right thing doesn't cover health insurance or student loans. And the right thing certainly doesn't help you explain to your parents why you just got fired from your dream job. But fate, as it turns out, has a flair for drama. The next morning, his phone rang before he'd even had his first cup of coffee. It wasn't a friend checking in or a recruiter calling about a new gig. It was an agent, not for actors but for book deals. Somehow, word of what he'd uncovered had leaked just enough to set off a frenzy in the publishing world. The agent told him that major publishers were already circling, eager to buy the rights to his story. Not just the crimes he'd uncovered, but the cover-up, the studio's retaliation, and his own transformation from quiet editor to Hollywood whistleblower. One call turned into 5, then 10. By noon, there were emails from streaming platforms, documentary filmmakers, and even a few A-list actors who wanted to play him on screen. It was absurd. Less than 24 hours ago, he'd been escorted out of the studio like a criminal. Now he was being offered advances that could wipe out his debts, buy him a house, and set him up for life. The same industry that had tried to bury him was now willing to pay millions to make him the center of a story. And as intoxicating as that was, Josh couldn't help but feel a simmering mix of vindication and caution. After all, he'd seen firsthand how quickly Hollywood could turn on you. Would these offers still be on the table if he refused to play along with their spin? Would the powerful people he'd exposed come after him harder once his story went public? And then there was Denzel. Josh hadn't heard from him since the day he handed over the USB drive. He didn't know what Denzel had done with the files, or whether he was quietly working behind the scenes to bring the guilty parties to justice. But he had a feeling, an instinct, that Denzel was the reason the offers had come so quickly. Maybe he'd whispered Josh's name in the right ears. Maybe he'd made a few calls to people who could change the course of a life overnight. Still, the decision wasn't simple. Taking the deal meant stepping into the spotlight in a way Josh had never imagined. It meant telling the world not just what he'd found, but who he was, what he believed in, and why he risked everything. It meant inviting scrutiny, criticism, and maybe even legal threats. But it also meant a chance to expose the kind of rot that thrives in darkness, the kind that only survives because too many people look the other way. He spent the day pacing his apartment, phone in hand, weighing the offers. Each one seemed bigger than the last. Some were promising full creative control. Others dangled the possibility of working with Oscar-winning directors. And yet, a small part of him wondered if he was ready for what came next. Could he handle being the face of a story this explosive? Could he live with the consequences of making enemies out of some of the most powerful people in entertainment? By the time the sun set, Josh knew one thing for sure. His life was never going back to the way it was. The studio had fired him to silence him, but in doing so, they'd made him louder than ever. They'd given him the kind of platform most people only dream of, and he wasn't about to waste it. Maybe he'd take the biggest deal on the table. Maybe he'd pick the one that let him tell the story exactly as it happened, without sanitizing the truth. Or maybe he'd surprise everyone and release it himself for free, just to make sure the world knew what was really going on. Whatever he chose, he knew the balance of power had shifted. He wasn't just a junior editor anymore. He was a whistleblower with the world's attention, and maybe, just maybe, the leverage to change things. Now the only question left was this. What would you do if you held the kind of truth that could bring an empire to its knees? Would you take the money, the fame, the safety net? Or would you risk it all to make sure every last detail saw the light of day? Because for Josh, the next phone call could either make him a legend